Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. Today we're tackling the ultimate exotic lens showdown. Which is better for you, the 400-2.8 or the 600 f4? As full-time wildlife photographers, my wife and I own both lenses for Nikon and Sony, so I'm sharing my insights based on real-world experience. Choosing between these two isn't easy. It's not because a 400's bad or a 600's bad, but because both are absolutely excellent and it's a big investment. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, and a lot of assumptions about these lenses just plain wrong. I think you'll be surprised at some of the revelations in this video. I'll also keep things as brand agnostic as possible since most considerations apply regardless of the manufacturer. That said, my first go-to rule is to pick the focal length that lets you fill the frame the way you want with just the bare lens, at least the majority of the time. This means you're not constantly relying on teleconverters, heavy cropping, or in some cases, running backward because you're too close to the subject. My second rule is to really consider how important the 800mm range is versus the 400mm range for your photography, and more on that soon. And no matter which you choose, you'll probably wish for the other one occasionally. There's just no perfect solution. Finally, keep in mind that this video offers general guidelines. There may be exceptions, but I can't cover every single scenario or we'd be here all day. So let's dive into the key considerations and see how each lens stacks up. Hopefully, by the end, you'll have a clearer path forward for your next big lens purchase. Reach. The first and most obvious consideration is reach. How much lens do you need to fill the frame the way you want? This can be trickier than it seems since subject distance varies and both lenses often deliver equally good results. To give you a visual comparison, I ran a quick backyard test using the sparrow-sized fake bird at about 20 feet or 6 meters. This shows you what you can expect from 400mm all the way up to 840mm. This also demonstrates my focal length rule of thumb. Generally speaking, smaller targets need bigger lenses. As a side note, for the most part, we're going to talk about focal ranges from 400mm to 840mm in this video. Well, you can add a 2x to the 600 f4. It's not all that common. Generally, if I need 1200mm, my subject is probably just too far away, with the notable exception of tiny little targets. In addition, AF accuracy is sometimes a challenge with the 600 plus 2XTC, so it's not a very typical combo for me, and I think that probably goes for most shooters. Still, I successfully use it from time to time, like for this shot, but those times are admittedly few and far between for most shooters, so we'll stick with the more typical 400 to 840mm range for this discussion. However, if you think you'd benefit from 1200mm, then that puts you solidly into the 600 f4 camp. Okay, so we're going to jump to my office for a bit here. We're going to do this throughout the video when I have different examples to show you, but right now I want to do an exercise, and that is to take a look at my most commonly used focal lengths, because that is something everybody looking at one of these exotic lenses should absolutely do. Again, I think it's important to match the lens with the focal lengths you use the most. And the thing is, most people are going to have some basis to start with. Most people aren't going to grab a camera, brand new camera, and put a 400-2.8 or a 600 f4 on it, right? You're going to have maybe one of those super zooms that go up to 600mm. So you probably have a bunch of shots already in a catalog that'll give you some idea of what focal lengths you use most of the time. And that cataloging software will likely show you those focal lengths. And the thing is, what we're concerned about really is the extreme ends. Because at 600mm, obviously a 600 f4 is going to be brilliant. And at 560, that 400 plus the 1.4 TC, it's just a little bit behind that 600. So both of those are close enough not to care. What we're concerned with is the 400mm and 800mm ranges, because a 600 can't shoot at 400. So that's a problem. And a 600 f4 is better at 800 than a 2x on a 400-2.8. And we'll talk about all the reasons as far as AF consistency, sharpness, and AF speed later in the video, so stay tuned for all that. But for right now, let's take a look at our most commonly used focal lengths and how to figure that out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into Lightroom over here. We're going to make sure we're in the library module, and we're going to go to one of our folders here. Now, I have this sorted out by year, so everything I shot in 2024 is under this folder, and that amounts to 91,000 images. So I'm going to click that, make sure that I have that selected. So I'm looking at 91,000 images here, and then I'm going to go to metadata. And I'm going to look for something called focal length. And if you don't see that, just give these little double arrows a click and you'll be able to select it from a menu. As far as the other menus, make sure that the word all is selected across the top. Otherwise, you're not going to get all your 91,000 images here. And just you can double check them, make sure that whatever your image count is, it's up here like that. So anyhow, we're going to go through, and what we're going to do is we're start at 400 millimeter. I'm going to go down here, and I'm just looking in the range of 400 millimeter because if I have a 400-2.8, I can get closer, I can step forward, step back, whatever. So for 400 millimeter, I got about almost 5,000 images. And if I look in that general range, I can maybe bump that up to about 6,000 of my 91,000 images. We're in that 400 millimeter range where I could have used maybe a 400-2.8. Then I'm going to go down to the 600 millimeter range just out of curiosity. And you can see that's 40,000 images. And we see some other counts here, like 560 was at 2,600 or whatever here. So, basically I'm using a lot in that 600 millimeter range. And this could have worked with a 600 f4 or a 400-2.8 with a 1/4 converter. So that I'm not as concerned about. But when we get down to the 800 and 840 millimeter range, you can see I have almost 32,000 images, or a little over 32,000 images between 800 and 840. Now, 800 could have been the 800 PF, or it might have been the 400-2.8 with a teleconverter on it. But regardless, it's in that range. And you can see that for me, the 600/840 range is definitely something I use more than I use the 400 millimeter range. But that may not apply to you. So again, sort through your focal lengths and just see, do you have a lot of stuff at that 400 millimeter range? Is most of it at 600? Is most of it at 800? And if you don't have a lens that goes all the way up to 800, so if you have a super zoom, you're going to have to kind of consider, hey, when I'm processing my images, am I always cropping? Because if you are, then the 600 plus 1.4 TC going up to 840 for you might be a better choice. However, if a lot of times you're at 600 and then you're backing down and you're not cropping that much, then it's probably a 400-2.8/560 situation for you. So again, it's going to be all different. And if you find everything's kind of equally split, you have, a third of them are around 400, a third of them are around 600, and a third of them are around 800. That's, again, maybe think about a 400-2.8 because they're a little more flexible. You can't shoot a 600 millimeter at 400 millimeter. So, all this stuff to consider, but this is always a good place to look. Size and weight. The 400mm f2.8 is both smaller and a little lighter than the 600mm f4. Weight is surprisingly close. On average, the 600mm lenses are only about 7.5% heavier than their 400mm stablemates. Not a lot, but enough to notice in my opinion. The size difference is more significant, with the 600mm lenses nearly 23% larger than their 400mm siblings. From a practical standpoint, the 400-2.8 is easier to pack and carry, typically fitting into carry-on size bags with a camera attached, unlike the 600 f4, which requires removing the camera to fit. Still, I take my 600 with me all the time when I travel by plane, and it's not a deal breaker at all. In the field, the 400mm is easier to handhold, whereas the 600mm can sometimes become unwieldy and difficult to manage, at least by hand, for some shooters. So this means the 400-2.8 offers more flexibility for maneuvering and can sometimes allow you a closer, more intimate approach to wildlife. Of course, with lenses like these, you have to sometimes consider things like monopods and tripods, and here again, the 400mm has an advantage since you can potentially get away with a little smaller support gear. Bottom line, for size and weight, the 400mm f2.8 is the clear winner. Feature set. As for features, the vast majority, if not all of the 400-2.8s and 600 f4s I've seen, share the same feature set from each manufacturer for each generation of lens. For example, if you look at my Nikon 400TC and my 600TC, you'll see they have the same number of buttons, both feature focus and control rings, there's a function ring on both, and both have the same switches on the side. The same goes for Sony. Both the 400 and the 600 have the same buttons and switches. So, at least within the same generation of glass, it's a tie for features. In addition, lenses from the same generation usually have the same optical technology like nanocoats and ED elements, all that sort of thing, and they usually have equally fast AF motors. Oh, and stay tuned for an AF speed test in just a bit. Bottom line, if you're trying to decide between the 400 and the 600 based on features, it doesn't work. Basically, it's a tie where everybody wins. Maximum aperture. Next, we have maximum aperture, and ostensibly, it seems like the 402.8 is the clear winner here. However, it's trickier than it appears on the surface. When considering f2.8 versus f4, the mistake most people make is thinking strictly about f-stops without regard to focal length and distance. On the surface, it would seem the 402.8 has an advantage in both subject isolation and allowing you to shoot at one stop lower ISO or one stop faster shutter speed, depending on what you need. However, you also have to consider subject distance, and that's where things get interesting. Let's pick this apart a little bit. First, let's talk about the one-stop advantage with ISO and toss subject distance into the ring. Let's look at a couple of scenarios. In the first scenario, let's say we have two people side by side, one with a 402.8 and the other with a 600 f4. We'll also say the 402.8 shooter is at ISO 3200 while the 600 f4 shooter is at ISO 6400. In order to get the same framing as the 600mm shooter, the 400mm shooter will have to crop the image by a factor of 1.5 times. When that happens, the relative output noise is actually the same or even a little worse from the 400mm shot than it is from the 600mm shot, despite the ISO advantage with the 402.8. In short, if both shooters printed a 16:24 from their image, the uncropped 600mm image will look as good or slightly better than the cropped 400mm shot, even though it was shot at one stop lower ISO. I actually cover this topic in another video, and I'll post a link for it in the card above and in the description area below, but let's look at an example of this in action. So let's take a look at this, and I'll prove to you how this actually works, because sometimes this really drives it home for people. So let's jump over to Lightroom here. And if you look, we have a little color checker chart. And this is the exact scenario we just talked about. 600mm, f4, 6400, 400mm, same distance, 2.8, 3200, right? So in theory, it seems like this should look one stop better when it comes to ISO. And if you were just looking at 100% pixels, it would. Okay, but we have to crop this, and what we're concerned about is comparative output, because if we wanted to make, say, a 16:20 print of this, or a 12:18, or if we wanted to output it for web, we want to see what the end result noise is going to look like once these images are normalized. So what I did is I cropped this down so that it has the same framing as what we see here. We're going to jump over to Photoshop real quick. And this is the 400mm shot cropped now, okay? And it came out to about 5,500 pixels across. Now, what I did is I have the 600mm shot, and I put that on top of it here, but I did reduce it down to that same 5,500 pixels from the 8256 that it started with, again, because we are trying to do comparative output. We want to look at these images as if they were the same size, which is exactly what I just did here. So how does that affect the noise? Let's zoom way in here to about 300%. I like these little boxes here, these little gray ones here. They make it really easy to see the noise. This is the 600mm at 6400. This is the 400mm at 3200. Sure doesn't look like a stop difference, and honestly, when I go back and forth between them, it almost seems like this 600 has slightly less noise than the 400. It's very, very close, but basically, we did not gain a thing by having that f2.8 aperture because we had to crop. However, the preceding scenario only applies if the 400mm shooter cannot fill the frame the same way as the 600mm shooter can. If the 400mm shooter can get 1.5 times closer to the target, then they will enjoy the extra step of ISO since they are now filling the frame the same way as the 600mm shooter. In that scenario, the advantage goes to the 402.8 without a doubt. But you got to keep in mind that wildlife doesn't always allow you to just wander up 1.5 times closer when you want to. So to give you a quick example of this, let's take a look at, once again, we have the 600 here at 6400, the 400 at 3200, but this time we're filling the frame. And if we zoom in, it's very clear that the 400 has that one-stop advantage for us. So it really does pay to fill the frame with that 402.8. It can be a huge advantage if you're in a low light situation and you can fill it. The biggest trick is that you have to be able to fill the frame in order to enjoy what you see here on the screen. Okay, so what about shooting the same ISO and having a one-stop shutter speed advantage with the 402.8? Once again, subject distance is key. Let's say the 400mm and 600mm at the same distance again. We'll also say the 400mm shooter is at 1/2000th of a second and ISO 3200, while the 600mm shooter is only at 1/1000th of a second at that same 3200 ISO. Although the 400mm shooter enjoys one stop faster shutter speed, because they have to crop, the resulting output image will look about one stop worse than the frame-filling 600mm shot for the same reasons we saw a moment ago. However, if the 400mm shooter can get closer and fill the frame the same way the 600mm shooter is, then they'll not only have a shutter speed that's one stop faster, but will also have the same output noise when they print or export for the web. What about subject isolation? The 400-2.8 must have shallower depth of field and better subject isolation than the 600 f4, right? Not so fast. Once again, subject distance comes into play. If the 400mm lens is shooting from the same position as the 600mm lens, the 600mm lens will actually have just a touch shallower depth of field, resulting in a tiny bit better subject isolation and a touch more background blur. You can see that with these two examples. It's close, but the depth of field is slightly shallower with the 600mm lens. You can also look at a depth of field calculator to verify this. As you can see here, at 15 meters, our depth of field is 0.14 meters with the 600 f4 and 0.23 meters with the 400-2.8. Of course, if you can fill the frame with the 400-2.8 the same way you can with the 600 f4, then you will see that shallower depth of field from the 400-2.8 and a little better subject isolation with even a touch more background blur as shown in this shot. Naturally, if you're too far back with a 400, you can add a teleconverter and get very close to the same field of view as the 600mm f4. However, you're also now shooting at f4, so that faster f-stop no longer offers any advantage for you. So while the 400mm and its f2.0 aperture can absolutely positively give you an edge, you'll only enjoy it if you can fill the frame the same way you would have with the 600. Minimum focus distance. What about minimum focus distance? One argument for the 400 over the 600 is that it has closer minimum focus distance. Typically, a 600 f4 will focus down to about 14 or 15 feet, and a 400-2.8 down to about 8 or 9 feet. However, that doesn't tell the whole story. You also have to consider magnification and reproduction ratio at minimum focus distance, and that's where things get interesting. For example, the Nikon 600TC has a maximum reproduction ratio of 0.14x versus the 400TC at 0.17x. And the higher the number, the greater the magnification. The Sony lenses have similar reproduction ratios, with the 600 at 0.14x and the 400 at 0.16x. For reference, Canon is also close with the 600 at 0.15x and the 400 at 0.17x. We'll use Nikon for our example with this little fake bird. Figure this guy, again, is about the size of a sparrow. As you can see, yes, the 400-2.8 is getting you a bit more magnification at minimum focus distance, and you'd need a slight crop of the 600mm version to get the same framing, again, at minimum focus distance for that lens. However, you also have to be at 2.5 meters instead of 4.3 meters to enjoy the advantage with the 400-2.8. Some critters may allow that close of an approach, but at least in my experience, you're often lucky just to get in that 4.3 meter range. From 4.3 meters, the same distance as the 600mm at minimum focus distance, this is what you get with that 400-2.8. Now the 600mm has a significant advantage in magnification. If you add a TC to the 400-2.8 at the same distance, it's still coming up a tiny bit short, although arguably close enough not to care. And of course, you could always add the TC to the 600mm as well. Overall, I don't think there's a huge difference in the field for reproduction ratio with these lenses, since the only time it really comes into play is if you're shooting a very small subject and can get very close to that subject. I think actual physical focus distance is more of a consideration. The 600mm allows you to keep farther back and not scare off skittish subjects while getting close to the same magnification of the 400 at minimum focus distance. However, if you're shooting in tight quarters, like say on a boardwalk against a barrier of some sort, like a porch or a hide, or just typically find yourself closer than the 14 or 15 foot minimum focus distance of the 600mm, then the 400mm is really the only option. However, if you don't run into physical distance problems all that much, then the 600mm might be a better bet. For what it's worth, I can count on one hand with a few fingers left over the number of times a year that this comes into play for me with the 600. So for the stuff I shoot, running up against minimum focus distance isn't a key consideration, and I tend to appreciate the longer working distance provided by the 600mm lens. However, this may not apply to you, so choose wisely. Always remembering you can tack a 1.4 TC onto the 400mm if you need that extra working distance. Oh, and as a side note, when you add a TC to your lens, it does not affect minimum focus distance, but it does, of course, increase magnification. So when dealing with really small, closer subjects, I often add a TC to my 600 or 400 for that extra bump in magnification. And of course, if both lenses are at minimum focus distance with that TC attached or engaged, the 400mm will still get you a little bit more magnification. Sharpness. So which is sharper, the 400 or the 600? Well, it's really too close to care. I think where the rubber hits the road with this is when you start adding TCs for equivalent focal ranges. I did some sharpness tests, so let's go to the computer and take a look. Okay, so we are going to compare sharpness with the lenses and the teleconverters and all these different mixes here to see what's what. So the first thing though is this was done in 4K, so if you want to get the best experience, make sure you click that little cog wheel down there if you have a high enough resolution monitor and set that resolution up so that it's all the way maxed out for you there on YouTube so you get the best experience here. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and this is straight 400 versus straight 600. And I want to show you this because a lot of people think that there's a significant difference in sharpness between these two lenses, and when I zoom in, you'll find out that that's just not the case. If you look at the 600 versus the 400, right here in the center area of the frame, they are virtually identical. I don't know that a mere human would be able to differentiate these one way or the other. They are very, very close. If we go up to the APS-C and DX crop line here, once again, very close. If we go to the extreme corner, I sound like a broken record. They are very, very close. I don't see much of a difference here at all. And if we go over here, go off to the side, if we look at this text here, again, everything is incredibly, incredibly close between these two straight primes. So let's look at the next one though, which is going to be 560 versus 600, because a lot of people with the 400-2.8 are wondering how does it stack up to a straight 600mm. So we have 560 here on the left. This is a 400-2.8. The 400-2.8 is always going to be on the left. The 600 is on the right. So let's go ahead and zoom in. And once again, you can see it is very close. I think maybe the 600 has a very slight edge here if you look at this text, but it's not huge. If we go over here, it's the same thing. It is very, very close. Here in the center, we're seeing about the same level of detail. I think the 600 does have just maybe a touch more contrast or something. It is a little tiny bit better, but man, I don't think that, again, I think it's so close as to not care. If we go up to the APS-C DX crop corner over here, once again, the 600 has a slight edge here, which isn't a surprise because, again, it's not using a teleconverter, but the 560, this 400 with the 1.4 is incredibly close here. I don't know that for actual field work, you'd really be able to tell much of a difference here. As we get towards the edges here, once again, this is the extreme edge here, and they're still very, very close. Again, a 600 has maybe the slightest edge here. You know, if I was going to put a percentage on it, I'd say maybe the 600 is 5, maybe 10% sharper than the 400 with the teleconverter, but it is so close that, again, I feel like you could just add a little tiny bit of sharpening and these would be neck and neck. So that looks pretty good. Next, let's look at the 800mm range. That means that the 2x converter is on the 400-2.8 and the 1.4 teleconverter is engaged with the 600 TC. So once again, the 600 is on the right. On the left, we have the 400 TC with the 2x converter attached. And let's zoom in. And as you can see, once again, pretty close here in the center. I'm definitely thinking that between the two of these, the 600 has the advantage here. Going over here, very, very close. But again, so this is really, really close in these areas here. I don't think this is enough to care about that much. But as we get towards these edges here, once again, I think this is very close. I think the 600 is starting to pull ahead a little bit here, but not by much. Again, I don't know that this would really bother me too much. Now, as we get over towards the far corner, you can see that the 2X is really falling apart compared to the 1.4 with the 600. And as we go down here a little bit, you can see the side here of the frame. This is like this area in through here. You can see the side of the frame here. The 600 with the 1.4 TC is definitely showing an advantage here. And I realize a lot of people are more worried about this area here, this central area. And in the central area, again, they're kind of neck and neck. But consider if you're shooting like a vertical shot of a wildlife subject, a lot of times the head ends up in this kind of area here. And when we zoom in, we see we definitely have a clear advantage. At this point, this is definitely a clear advantage with the 600 and the 1.4 versus the 2X over there. Now, an option that's available to Nikon shooters with these lenses with the built-in teleconverters, and hopefully other manufacturers will start doing that soon too, is that we can put a 1.4 teleconverter behind our 400 TC and then engage the teleconverter in the lens, so we have basically stacked 1.4 TCs. And let's take a look at how those compare. So this time on the right, we have the stacked TCs, and on the left, we have the 2X converter. So when we zoom in, it is very close, but I think the 2X has got an edge here, just looking at this text here versus this text. And we go here, it's the same thing. The 800 is looking pretty good versus the 784. We go over to this DX corner here. The 784 is once again trailing behind the 2X converter. So the stacked TCs are not doing as well here in this central area. Now, when we go over towards the edges, it gets a little bit more interesting. The stacked TCs actually do better in those corners than the 2X converter does. So to me, this is a little bit tricky because, I like to have nice sharp sides, which is what I have here with the 784. This is definitely sharper than what we're seeing with the 2X converter. However, I also know that most of my images are still going to be more towards this central area. So between these two, I think that the straight 800 is a better choice than a stacked pair of TCs. Now I realize that the reason a lot of Nikon shooters like to have that TC behind the 400 is they're 560 all the time and they can just flip that switch to get to 800. But if that's something you do all the time or would think you would do all the time, maybe you have to really consider, was that the right choice for a lens? Maybe the 600 with the built-in TC that gives you better overall quality than either of these would have been a better way to go when you're at least at that 800 millimeter range. So in any event, that is kind of it for Nikon. Let's take a look at Sony and see how that stacks up. So once again, we're going to start off with 400 versus 600, 600 again on the right. So we're going to zoom in, and as you can see, no big surprise here. These lenses are once again neck and neck. So if you're a Sony shooter, and I'm be willing to bet that the same is true for Canon, you're not going to see much of a difference between 400 and 600 millimeter. Both of them are going to do really, really well. So straight lenses, no teleconverters. I don't know that there's any real advantage one way or the other from a sharpness standpoint. So let's go on and look at 560 versus 600. So here we have 560 versus 600. I'm going to zoom on in here. And once again, we see that the 600, straight 600, is a little bit stronger than the 400 with the TC in there, but it's not by what I would call a significant margin. This is why I was saying earlier, it just doesn't really bother me that much to use a 400 2.8 with a TC versus a 600. The 600 certainly has an edge, but it's not an insurmountable one. Now with Sony, as I get more towards these extreme edges, I am seeing a definite difference here, maybe a little more so than what we saw with the Nikon. But still, I think for the main area where you would be using the lens, even here along the side, it looks pretty darn good. You are kind of slipping a little bit here towards that very extreme edge, but the area where you would maybe have an animal's head is still decently sharp here with the 1.4. So I really wouldn't lose any sleep over the 400 Sony with a 1.4 versus the 600 Sony. Finally, let's look at 800 versus 840. Again, this is the Sony with a 2X on the 400 versus the 1.4 on the 600. And in this case, again, in the center, it's pretty darn close. We saw that with the Nikon as well. Not a huge difference here. As we get towards those edges, I am starting to think that, the 600 has a little bit of an edge. If you look, it's got a little better contrast still, and it's a little bit sharper here. And this is the like the APS-C/DX corner over here. So that's how far out we're going to start seeing that difference. And as we get more towards the corners here, and we can see that once again, it is definitely sharper with the 1.4 versus the 2X on the Sony, which isn't a real big surprise. And as we come down here and we look at the text, we can see that the 600 with the 1.4 still maintains an edge, but the Sony with the 2X does pretty well here. So, but still, there's definitely a little bit of a difference there when we look at those side by side. So overall, 1.4 teleconverters look pretty good with this, and the 400 takes a 2X. It takes it reasonably well, but if you want the ultimate edge in sharpness at 800 millimeter. The 600 with a 1.4 does a little better job for you. But of course, again, as we keep emphasizing, the 600 can't shoot at 400, so you have to kind of balance that out. AF speed. Next, let's compare AF speed between the 400 and the 600, including TCs. First, a quick note on methodology. I set the lens to minimum focus distance. Then I focus on a distant target, trees at infinity usually. Using an Atomos recorder, I count the frames from AF start to lock on. Since this test relies on the camera's AF system rather than recalling a focus distance, slight timing variations can occur due to light and conditions. To ensure fairness, all tests were conducted at about the same time with about maybe a 5% margin of error, we'll call it. I also repeated each test multiple times to ensure consistency. Okay, so we have our 400 versus 600 AF speed results. Once again, as a quick reminder, this is minimum focus distance to infinity. It is very tempting to look at the Nikon versus Sony results and make those comparisons, but we don't really care about those for this video because we're not comparing those lenses, because if you have a Sony camera, you're probably not going to buy a Nikon lens for it and vice versa. So what we want to look at is between the brands. So let's start off with the Nikon side here, and let's look at the straight lenses, no TCs, and they're very close. We have 0.4 seconds and 0.43 seconds. You're not going to see a difference there. Now, where it gets interesting is when you start using teleconverters, because you're using a Nikon 400 2.8 plus a 1.4 to simulate what you have with a 600 f4 to get to that same sort of focal range there. And that's 0.5 seconds versus 0.43 seconds down here. Again, not a big deal. I don't know that you'd actually be able to see that. Next, we have the 800 millimeter range, which is the 400 2.8 and a 2x TC versus a 600 f4 and a 1.4 TC, and you can see that we have 0.73 seconds with the 400 2.8 and 0.57 seconds with the 600 f4. So the 600 f4 is definitely giving you a little more speed there. Moving down, we also have the option for stacking TCs. So that's the 400 2.8 plus 1.4 TC stack at 0.83 seconds, which is even more significant than the 0.73 that we saw with a 2x converter. So you're going to feel that slowdown there. And for reference, if you're a Nikon shooter and you've ever used the 200 to 500, 0.83 seconds is the exact time it takes to go from minimum focus distance to infinity. And most people kind of regard that as a slow-ish kind of focusing lens. So this gives you kind of a reference point there. With the stack, it's going to be just as slow as old 200 to 500, and it's just a little bit faster with the 2x TC, and obviously the 600 f4 is going to be noticeably quicker than either one of them, or at least a little bit noticeable over that 2x TC. Moving over to Sony, 400 2.8 is at 0.5 seconds versus 0.4 seconds. That kind of surprised me. I ran the test a couple of times, but those were the numbers. You know, there is a margin of error here, so maybe the 400 was a little slow and the 600 was a little fast that time. I don't know, but within a tenth of a second there, I don't know that you would notice any real difference there. So next, let's look at that 600 millimeter range. So we're at 0.73 seconds for the Sony versus 0.4. You are definitely going to notice that. And, you know, you can definitely see that. You can definitely tell the difference between using the 600 Sony and the 400 with a 1.4. At least I can when I'm out in the field. And going up to that 800 millimeter range, 1.1 seconds versus 0.77 seconds. So once again, from an AF speed standpoint, it's definitely better to use that 600 f4. And this goes back to what we've been talking about as far as picking the lens that you're not going to need teleconverters with, at least most of the time or as often as you can avoid them. So hopefully that's helpful. AF consistency. The other side of the sharpness coin is focus accuracy. When I talk about focus accuracy, I'm not referring to sharpness. That's the test we just looked at a few moments ago. And overall, everything is pretty sharp, as you saw. What I'm talking about is how consistently accurate a lens focuses with TCs attached. You can have the sharpest combo in the world, but if the camera can't focus it accurately, it might as well be a Coke bottle. Unfortunately, focus accuracy isn't readily tested. With AF accuracy, you have a seemingly infinite number of combinations of lighting, subjects, camera to subject distance, AF areas, AF settings, subject detection options, firmware versions, lens and TC combos, user skill, and so on and so forth that can influence it. Plus, what looks perfectly sharp to one photographer is unacceptable to another, so AF accuracy is really tough to quantify. Still, anecdotally, I can say this much. When it comes to static subjects, Most of the time, I'm pretty happy with TCs, especially the 1.4. It's usually great on either lens, and I'm confident I'll get about the same number of precisely focused photos with that 1.4 TC than without it. However, the 2X is a little less reliable, more so on the 600 f4s of the world than the 400 2.8s, but I still find AF accuracy seems to go down even a little bit for static subjects when it's attached. On the other hand, for action, it's a little different story. For the most part, I find the 400 plus 1.4 TC does not seem to suffer very much AF consistency, although I have to say my straight 600 seems just a tiny bit better for action than the 400 2.8 with a 1.4. Still, close enough not to care. With the 1.4 and the 600mm, talking about that 800mm range, I notice AF accuracy drops, and in my experience, the same is true with the 400 2.8 and the 2X. Between the two lenses, the 600 f4 plus 1.4 TC has always been more accurate for me than the 400 with a 2X. I'm actually to the point I avoid using a 400 2.8 with a 2X converter for action, but again, that's just my personal experience. I asked about AF accuracy on the BCG forums just to see what others with these lenses thought, and it was, as you might expect, all over the place. For the most part, everyone thought that the 400 2.8 with a 1.4 TC was just as accurate for static subjects as the bare lens, which agrees with my experience as well. For action with the 400 2.8, it was more mixed. It seems the vast majority, were happy with the 400 2.8 and 1.4 TC, and only a few less with the 2X. For the 600, most agreed that the 1.4 was as good as the bare lens for static subjects, and that most, but not all, saw some degree of drop-off in AF accuracy for action with the 1.4. The drop in AF accuracy is worse when they added the 2X to the lens. So although AF accuracy sort of defies testing, anecdotally and very generally, it seems that we can say that both lenses seem more consistent with the 1.4 TC than with the 2X TC. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that at times, AF inaccuracies can also be caused by trying to use too much lens for a given subject. If you're adding a 2X TC to a 600mm to make an elephant large enough in the frame to make the shot work, you're probably too far away. The atmospherics between you and the subject have a huge impact, and I have a video that talks about it called the #1 Sharpness Killer. I'll link that video above and in the comments. Also, this is how I use TCs. For the most part, you should use a TC to finish filling the frame with an animal that's already at a reasonable range, not to try to drag something in that's way too far off just so you can crop it really heavily later on the computer. Final thoughts. Hopefully, one or more of the points already discussed made your decision between these two optics. However, if you're still on the fence, here's a few final thoughts that might push you one way or the other. First, think about how important the extremes of our range are to you, basically 800, 840mm versus 400mm. The thing is, the 560 to 600mm range, it's great with either lens. Obviously, that range with the 600mm f4 is stellar, but 560 with the 400 2.8 plus 1.4 TC is close enough not to care for most of us. However, the 400 plus 2X isn't quite as good in either sharpness or AF speed or, in my experience, AF consistency as the 600 plus 1.4 TC combo. However, the 600 f4 can never get you to 400mm. Plus, if you shoot at 400mm quite a bit, it makes more sense to have the faster, higher quality optic covering 400mm rather than trying to fill that range in with a zoom lens of the same focal length, since even a quality zoom can't really compete with a 400 2.8. So the big question is, which is more critical for your type of shooting, 400 or 800 840? Second, and along with that last point, consider how important versatility is to you. Obviously, the 400mm is more versatile since it gives you 3 lenses in one versus basically 2 lenses in one with the 600. Again, recognizing that you can use it with a 2X at 1200mm, but also recognizing that not too many people do. However, do you really need that versatility? I find many people with 400 2.8 lenses very seldom use them at 400mm and actually would have been better off with a 600 f4. Sure, it's nice to have the 400mm option, but if you only use it a few times a year, is it worth taking the hit, minor as it may be, at the longer end when using a 2X TC? So if 400mm isn't one of your most used focal lengths, sometimes it really is better just to have something like a 100 to 400 paired with a 600 f4. Again, I think it really comes down to how critical 400mm is to your work. Third, how large are your typical targets? How close can you get to them? And how do you like to frame them? if you're dealing with larger animals that allow a relatively close approach. The 400-2.8 is generally the best choice since the 600mm can be frustratingly long in those circumstances. Ditto if you like to shoot environmental portraits. However, if you tend to favor tighter, more intimate shots, then you'll find the 600mm, often sometimes with a 1.4 TC, is really the way to go. The same applies if you shoot lots of smaller to medium-sized animals that may or may not allow a really close approach, which describes quite a bit of my shooting. Also, keep in mind that generally, the smaller the animal, the longer the lens you're going to want. However, there's a notable exception if you're often in situations where you can get close to the minimum focus distance of a 402.8 to that animal. In that case, the 400mm, with its closer physical focusing distance and increased magnification, definitely can have an edge. However, for most small animals, I find the 600mm actually has the edge because they don't let me get that close. In the end, there's no perfect lens for every situation, which leads me back to my original premise of choosing the lens you'll use least with teleconverters, cropping, or excessive backing up. Again, I'm usually fine with a 1.4 TC, but I'd like to not have it on for every single shot. In fact, when I'm considering which lens to take on a trip where I can bring only one, I try to decide if 400 and 560 is going to be my primary range, or if it's more likely to be in the 600 to 840mm range. For what it's worth, the bottom line for me personally is that the 600 f4 tends to work better most of the time than the 400 2.8, at least for what I shoot, how I shoot it, and where I choose to shoot it. If I had to choose, my vote would be for the 600 f4. However, I urge you to consider your own needs rather than just mimicking what I or any other YouTube personality tells you. Finally, if you're still not sure, consider renting the lens you're leaning towards and taking it out and photographing your typical subjects. Although it's not cheap to rent, it's a heck of a lot less than getting the wrong lens, selling it at a loss, and then buying the right one. So there you go. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. If you learned something today, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.